on research and pedagogical innovation.
En este momento daremos paso a la conferencia titulada Consideraciones e investigación en inglés como lengua extranjera en comunidades étnicas, a cargo del Dr. James Swisler de la Universidad de Monash, Australia, quien es un lingüista formado en esta mencionada universidad y es investigador y conferencista de la Universidad del Tolima, donde también es director del grupo de investigación Tolingüística. Sus líneas de investigación son la sociolingüística, la lengua indígena, la sociofonética y la identidad. Además, es un investigador independiente que trabaja con las comunidades indígenas Pijao en la recuperación de su idioma. Tiene numerosas publicaciones, tanto nacionales como internacionales.
At this time, we will continue with the conference entitled Considerations and Research in EFL in Ethnic Minority Communities, in charge of Dr. Swisler from Monash University, Australia. He is a linguist trained at Monash University, Australia, and is in the final weeks of his PhD. He is a researcher and lecturer with the Universidad del Tolima, where he is also the director of the Tolingüística Research Group. His research lines are social linguistics, indigenous language, sociophonetics, and identity. Additionally, he is a freelance researcher working with Pijao indigenous communities on language reclamation. He has numerous publications both at the national and international level.
Bienvenido, Dr. James Swisler. Para la UCEBA es un gusto contar con su participación en nuestro evento.
Welcome, Dr. Swisler. For our university, it is a pleasure to have your participation in our event.
Thanks. Okay, is this presenting all right? Can everyone see and hear me fine?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome. Please forgive the noise, but there's a group in the park with animals and cats, and I can't really control that. But anyway, so thanks for coming and listening to me. My name is James Swisler. I am a linguist with the Universidad del Tolima and with Monash University. My line of research is generally working with Indigenous communities and sociolinguistics. I've worked with Indigenous communities in three different continents, in Asia, South America, and Australia. And there are a number of things we need to keep in mind when working with ethnic minorities. And tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about the basics of the things we need to keep in mind when working with ethnic minority groups, because it is something that's increasingly more important in the liberal world, and we need to keep this in mind, because when we work with ethnic minorities, we often don't completely understand where we're going or what we should be doing, and sometimes that results in boundaries being overstepped, etc. So let's get started. I tend to speak a little on the quick side, so I'll try to speak a little more slowly tonight. So what is an ethnic community? That's a really, really important question that we need to keep in mind before we get started. We need to keep in mind that ethnicity and race are not the same thing. When we talk about ethnicity, we're not talking about race. Race tends to be a more of a physical category, and it is a category that the social sciences are generally tending to avoid because of the political connotations attached, and because basically it is only physical. When we go above the physical level, and humans are much more than their phenotype, where we're not really talking about race anymore. We're probably talking more about ethnicity. Now, Weber was possibly the first to get into ethnicity, and I'm going to use this quote. I know that it's like 99 years old, but it's still very much the definition we give for ethnicity in the social sciences, and among them linguistics. So when we look at ethnicity, ethnicity is the idea that a group of people share some kind of common descent. Yeah. Now, this idea of common descent may be because like they physically resemble each other. So we are bringing in case of like a case of race there, or because they share linguistic features. Like for example, they all have some kind of distant linguistic relative, or because they all inhabited some place before colonization by some people, or they migrated and they recognize that their roots are in some other place around the world. But the idea is that ethnicity is not a physical category. When we look at ethnicity, we're looking at the beliefs of the people, the beliefs that they share common descent, and that as a result of this common descent, that they have certain things in common, and this is ethnicity. And ethnicity goes far beyond any kind of skin pigmentation or hair type or facial features. And it's a far more binding category. And it's important to keep this in mind when we're looking at EFL in particular, because research that we've been leading here in Tolima and in parts of the south of Australia have shown that language education, particularly English as a foreign language education, does have a direct impact on local identities. And by local identities, I mean to say like regional identities, national identities, and particularly small entities, for example, community identities and ethnicity. And in terms of ethnicity, this is important because ethnic minority identities are often at a risk of being lost. Yeah. So where we don't find particularly strong phenotypical differences, we find that ethnic minority identity can be lost in 1 or 2 generations, depending on how the family and how the community deals with this. Yeah, and education is a very, very big factor in how communities can possibly like shift from one minority to the majority. Yeah, and the result is that EFL education is not welcome in a lot of communities precisely for this reason. For example, in my work here in Tolima, particularly in the south of Tolima, it is very common to encounter communities, particularly Indigenous communities, that refuse EFL education in their communities. And there are some legalities surrounding this, which we will look at soon, but often these communities will have contact with EFL because they're legally bound to do so. And for the educator, this often puts the educator in a particularly uncomfortable position where they're between a knife and the wall, because there's not much they can do. Either way, someone's going to get angry. In Colombia, we tend to think of 3 big groups when we look at ethnicity. We tend to think of the indigenous groups, but we need to keep in mind that indigeneity itself is not an ethnicity. Yeah, every indigenous group is a separate ethnicity. For example, the Nasa and the Pihao, which are with both of whom are in Tolima, they're both indigenous, but they're not the same ethnicity, and they should not be classed as such because there is no common descent there at all. Yeah. Next we have Afro-Colombians and Rom. But, and here's the very big but, and it's a flaw in ethnic thinking in Colombia, is that we restrict ethnic minorities to those groups. However, given the super diverse nature of larger metropoles nowadays, yes, these are the big ethnic minorities outside of the cities, but inside cities, we find that there are actually a variety of different ethnic minorities. For example, on the coast and in Bogota, there are large Arab communities, yeah, and that's an ethnic minority. Yep, and there are specialist schools for that, or where we find, for example, Jewish communities. Yeah, with Jewish schools. That's also an ethnic minority. Or, for example, where we find Chinese populations inside Colombia, and they have community education programs. That's also an ethnic minority. So when we look at the idea of ethnic minority, we really need to go above the traditional thinking of the three main groups. Yes, those three main groups are the ones that are protected by the Constitution, but we need to be more realistic in how we analyze society. We cannot be romantic in our sociological analysis of the population. We can't do that, yeah, because it's not being realistic. So when we look at the term ethnic minority, we need to be far more precise with what we're saying there. We need to say, well, an ethnic minority is any group that has the belief in common descent, whether it be physical descent or some kind of descent story, that is not shared by the majority of the population. Yeah, so the largest demographic unit in Colombia is the mestizo population. Yes. And the biggest minority groups are indeed the different indigenous groups, the Afro-Colombians and the Rom. Yes, but we need to keep in mind that there are actually more ethnic minorities in Colombia that are newer. And we, as like educators and as researchers, do need to keep these groups in mind, because just because they're not in the Constitution does not mean they don't have the same value. Yeah, these people have the same value. So I'm going to chat about Indigenous communities because that's where I work. Yeah, that's my context. However, the lessons from what I'm going to speak about are entirely translatable to the Afro community, the Rom community, or the other minorities which I mentioned, because it is quite possible that many of the participants as future EFL educators are going to have contact with these groups. Now, there are two important laws to keep in mind when looking at ethnic minorities here in Colombia. And the first is Ley 381 de 2010, which is the law of languages. This is actually one of the best language laws on the planet. A lot of people don't realize it, but what the law says is pretty incredible. It's pretty sad that the government itself doesn't actually execute the law, but for communities that actually speak their own language, for example, the Rom community, any of the Indigenous communities that actually maintain their Indigenous language, or the Creole speaking communities here in Colombia, all those languages are protected. So in those communities, EFL is not going to exist. Yeah, because the foreign language given to those groups is Spanish. Yeah, so all of the basic education and all the basic components are actually done, I'm sorry, in their language. So, for example, if I were to go to San Basilio de Palenque, I would find that education would be given in Palenquero and the foreign language classes would be Spanish. Or if I go to the far south of Tolima, where there are NASA schools, basic education would be given at NASA UM, and the foreign language education would be Spanish. But, the big but here, unfortunately, in Colombia, not all of the indigenous communities have an indigenous language. And this is very much the case here in Tolima, like with the Bihaus I work with, who I've been working with for almost a decade now. This doesn't happen. They don't have their own language. So the law doesn't actually apply to them. So what happens is they find, even though they have the right to ethno-education, because they lack the native linguistic component, a lot of the law doesn't actually apply to them. So they find themselves under the next law, which is Law 1651 of 2013, which I'm absolutely sure all of you are familiar with. It's the law of bilingualism in Colombia. So while the law of bilingualism in Colombia does not actually stipulate English, if you read it very carefully, it does suggest English, but it doesn't stipulate it. Yeah. It does, though, say, if you're not covered by Law 1381, you're covered by this law, and you're going to learn a foreign language. If your school or your parents don't choose one for you, it's going to be English. Yeah. So that's the context we're working with here. So in like central and central south Tolima, where I'm working and managing different projects, the students there and the youth there fall under the second law. So even the indigenous schools or the indigenous majority schools are teaching English because they don't fall under the protection of the first law. So the teachers find themselves in a position where the community knows about the first law, wants to be protected by the first law, but can't be protected by the first law. And as a result, there is a state of friction between these educators who really do try their best. They really do try their best. It's admirable, some of the stuff they have to endure. And the community whose position is actually very, very understandable. So when we're getting into the considerations for these communities, we need to look at, is it an ethnic protected school or is it a non-protected school? Yeah. In the case of an ethnic protected school, there's no EFL happening there. Why? Because they're covered by the law of languages from 2010. The only time you will find languages other than Spanish being taught as a foreign language there is when the school and the community itself have asked for the educator. So the government can't just send it in, and the Ministry of Education can't just come and say, oh no, you need to be learning English because of the the final exams at the education. Yep, no, sorry, that doesn't apply here. Unless the school asks for it. And yes, there are cases of that. There are cases in Florencia where that's happening. There are cases on the coast also where that's happening, where we find indigenous schools also teaching English. But most of the time what we'll find are non-protected ethnic majority schools where, for example, like the school I have a picture of here on the screen, it's in the municipality of Cojaima in central Tolima, and all of the kids there are Pijao. They all belong to resguardos. But because they're not protected under the law of languages, these kids are learning English, and the English teacher's in this really uncomfortable position with the community. So, what can we do for the community? What can we do for the teachers? And what can we do as researchers? Because the answers to these questions are in the hands of researchers, and teachers are researchers. So I'm not going to divide the two here. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the three things that we've been doing in Tolima that I've had a direct relationship with. So there are three projects. One in Ortega, which is, if you can see my mouse, it's here. And there are two in a Kojima, which is this here. Yep. If we have a look at this map, the red dots are all of the Pijao resguardos, whereas the green is the NASA. Yep. So we have three projects. I'm just going to pop them out like that. So we have one project which is looking at carefully constructing the subject. That project is under my direct supervision. Yep, it's with an Indigenous school that it's a long way away. It's a long way away from civilization in in air commas. But they do learn English there. So the question is, like, the community was saying, we don't want English here, but the government's imposing it. What can we do? So I've been advising the teacher, well, who are your students as subjects? Yeah. Who are your students? Who are your community? Yeah. Because we find that a lot of times the English that we're teaching comes with textbooks that are full of photos of happy little blonde kids with lots of material possessions in green parks in the Northern Hemisphere that are completely irrelevant to the context of this community. Yeah. And much of the photographic content of these textbooks actually denigrates the quality of life in these communities. So the answer here, well, the answer is not really that obvious. It's more so a process. Yeah, it's a process where the teacher, who's doing a fantastic job there, is creating their own material based on the books. Yeah, based on the books, where all the photographic material, when she uses it, is from locals. So we're not looking at, happy little blonde kids with lots of material possessions playing in pine-filled parks in the Northern Hemisphere. No. We're finding, happy little Pijao kids playing soccer in a park with very few trees on the outskirts of a desert. And, it's having a good effect because the children can relate with the subject, like the subject, not English, but the subject as the person being presented. And that's having effect. So we need to really ask, who is the subject we're teaching for? Not the subject we're teaching, but who are we teaching for? Who is the student as a subject? The second project, which is up here in Ortega, is one of my students whom I am supervising is using Indigenous culture, not language, to teach English. And it's having an interesting effect where this student is presenting Indigenous culture in a very respectful way now. He can do this because he himself is an Indigenous member of the community. And it's having an interesting effect because the kids are learning about their culture. They're recovering their culture. The community is in that process. And they're doing it in a way which they're learning the foreign language, but the foreign language is not actually becoming associated as part of the culture. And it's interesting. So in this case, my student has instrumentalized the language to teach his own culture to the community in such a way that the kids are not going to see the happy little blonde kids with lots of material possessions playing in Pinefield parks in North America, which is ridiculous. Yeah, the last project is one that I'm going to mention because it's had some questionable outcomes. I'm not exactly sure if it should continue. A final one is one as well, whom I'm mentoring, and he decided to use English along with some Indigenous terms that we've been compiling over the last decade in the field. And mixing English classes with like Indigenous language classes, it's not having a good effect. The community is not reacting well. The kids are getting confused. Yes, you can teach Indigenous communities English, it can be done. Like the first two projects are doing it very, very successfully. But this last project, my student's doing a fantastic job. He's really putting his heart into it. But the way that Indigenous languages index certain identity features in discourse really don't permit these words to be framed inside an EFL classroom. Yeah, if anything, the whole experience hasn't been a failure. Like or what it has done is it's shown that, you know, this is how we shouldn't be doing things. Yeah, this is really how we should not be approaching the whole affair, because it may blow up in our faces. Yeah. So let's go on to the considerations for research. So those are the three projects we've been doing. And the preliminary findings we have for these projects are, so when we're working with these Indigenous communities that aren't protected under law, we really need to focus on the Indigenous person as the subject. Yeah. We need to remove the smiling little blonde kid living in North America with lots of material possessions in Pinefield Parks. We need to remove all of that and really contextualize it for the community. And these communities have lots and lots of problems. Yep. For example, one of the communities where we're doing this is poor to the point where a lot of their houses don't actually have walls. They're just roofs and rafters. And the kids sleep in the roofs because, you know, it's really hot. Like, it's incredibly hot there. And the kids don't have walls on their houses. So even the notion of presenting material that would show, you know, these happy little North American kids with, you know, big houses and all that, it would just offend the community. So what we need to do is come and say, well, what's happening here? And, you know, how can the language be contextualized for the area? And it needs to be culturally contextualized as well, because we can't disengage language from culture. Language and culture can't be disengaged from each other. Yeah, expressions, like for when you're teaching English expressions in the classroom, well, those are culturally bound. They're culturally bound in certain ways that, like, really put things together. Or even the formulas for greeting people. You know, like, yes, good morning, how are you? All of these formulas are based on cultural conceptualizations and cultural structures. And these formulas are not always going to work, particularly in ethnic minority groups where their own formulas for doing social actions are under risk from the majority ethnic population anyway. So what you need to consider when you start working with ethnic minority groups is, who's the subject? And what are the cultural considerations that need to be taken into account for the language? Yeah. And when you enter as a researcher, there are more things. So yes, you go in as a teacher, that's fine. You go and you teach it, great. But we know the current movement is for teachers to be teacher researchers. Yeah. Or even for non-teacher researchers to go into the community. There are considerations. There are things that we need to take into account. Yeah, just let me buzz all of these down. And so we need to take these 4 questions into account when we enter a community. And the first thing is we're asking, well, what is knowledge? And why this is very much an epistemological question, and you would have tackled this some point during your degrees or your education. We, in academia, we tend to look at the nature of knowledge from very, very much a Western positivist notion. You know, it's something we can measure, or it's something we can know, etc. But when we're looking at small cultural groups. What is knowledge may actually be very, very different. For example, I worked with a group in Australia who believe, or whose concept of knowledge is actually far more ample. Yeah, and they use actual geographic features as discursive features. They use geographical features as features in how they tell stories and how they do things, and the feature itself is actually a form of knowledge. But if you come in as a Western educated researcher and the education you receive in Colombia is Western knowledge, don't deceive yourself otherwise. Discounts that. You know, that's not true. You know, that's mysticism, or that's, you know, that's witchcraft or whatever. But that brings us down to the idea, the notion of decolonialization of knowledge. If you plan to enter non-majority ethnic communities, you need to really look at how you're going to decolonialize knowledge. Yeah, because knowledge itself is attached to ethnicities. It is attached to histories. Yeah, just look, for example, your philosophy classes. Yeah, philosophy classes in Colombia, like, this person said this, and this person said that, and this person said this. That is really, really strongly attached to history. That is really strongly colonialized. Yeah, but when you're working with these communities whose cosmovision is so very different, you really need to break down that colonialization of knowledge. You really need to be asking yourself, okay, so I'm coming in here and I'm researching this, or I'm coming in here to teach this language. Is the process productive, or is the process colonial? What am I doing? Yeah. And it brings us to the next step of, well, who owns intellectual production? Yeah. Unfortunately, the academic model which we live in posits that, well, for example, if I go into the field and I write a wonderful book about, I don't know, the Bihar language, therefore the book belongs to me and all the knowledge in the book belongs to me because, you know, I wrote it. But is that the case? Am I the owner of the knowledge that my participants produced? Yes, I did the analysis. Yes, I did the discussion. But is putting my name as the owner of that knowledge actually going to help the community, particularly in the case of ethnic minority communities whose ethnic identity is already at stake? And that brings us to the final question you should be asking yourself when you're going to do educational research in these communities. Which of the three ethical models are you going to use? Are you going to use the traditional ethical paradigm? So basically, yep, I'm going to go in there, I'm not going to hurt everyone, no one dies here today. Great, great. Are you going to do advocacy? Yep, so is your educational research going to advocate for their culture? Yeah. So, for example, in the case of my student in Ortega who was teaching cultural, the local culture through English, like advocating and they're saying, you know, your culture is worth something, you know, hang on to it. Or are you going to go for the last model, which is empowerment? So basically you're saying, okay, so I'm here, I'm not doing research, we're doing research. You and I are going to work together, we're going to produce knowledge, and we're going to put that knowledge to use in the community, for the community, and by the community. Yeah. And when you start any kind of educational research in ethnic minority communities, given the high risks that they face, you need to ask yourself, am I doing the traditional paradigm? Am I going to be an advocate, or am I going to empower? And my dear participants, that brings me to the end and brings me time for questions. And why is that?
Muchísimas gracias a los asistentes y en especial al doctor James Swisler por su interesante conferencia.
Thanks to all attendees and especially to Dr. Swisler for his interesting conference.
Les recordamos de nuevo a los asistentes a nuestro congreso que a las 8 de la noche deben ingresar al mismo enlace de apertura para asistir al homenaje que se rendirá al maestro Gustavo Adolfo Jaramillo Tascón.
We remind the attendees of our Congress that at 8 o'clock you should enter the same opening link to attend the tribute that will be paid to the master Gustavo Adolfo Jaramillo Tascón.
Ahora daremos espacio para las preguntas de ustedes y quedan bajo la moderación de la profesora Olga Lisbeth Salamanca. Hasta luego.
Now we will
Swisler,
open a space for questions from the public, which are in chair of Professor Olga Lisbeth Salamanca. See you later.
Okay, we have Professor James. We have two questions here. And first one, Maria Camila Lazo is
Teacher, we don't hear you well. It's
I'm
really
sorry.
slow.
Is it better now? Okay. Maria Camila Lazo is asking
Yes.
is it hard to decolonize knowledge?
Maria Camila, it is particularly difficult to decolonize ourselves. To decolonize knowledge, we have to convert. Really, we need to start really deconstructing how we do this. It's not something you can do straight away, but knowledge, you can decolonialize it, but it's a very much a route of introspection as well. You need to look at, well, you know, what am I doing? Who am I? What is my effect on the community? And what's the relationship? It is difficult. I can say that from first-hand knowledge. It is difficult, but it is worth it. Yeah. There are a variety of books written on particularly on Indigenous research methodologies. For example, there's an author called Bagela Chalisa, I think it is, she has written a fantastic book about decolonializing knowledge, particularly in the African context, and it's worth having a look at.
Thank you.
We have space for a last question, I think, and it's from student Alejandra Santamaria Mendieta. How can we use English as a decolonial tool for empowerment, considering that it's a language that has been used to oppress?
That is a fantastic question, and that's actually the pretty much the root of what we're doing in Ortega and Kojaima. Given that the communities that we're working with have been oppressed, like first by Spanish, and now that the government is introducing like the colonial language of English into the communities, the educator really needs to, like as I said, needs to use the language so that the students take hold of it, so the students take ownership of the language and the language doesn't take ownership of them. So like, for example, where I said, you know, use the language classes to build the students as subjects instead of as learners, or use the language to show local culture instead of showing like foreign culture formulae. Use the language to show local cultural formulae, like use it for local cultural things, but doing so and respecting local language practices. So don't use it to teach like native languages. Use it in such a way to show that, you know, it's a linguistic code, and linguistic codes can be used in a way that's culturally sensitive. You need to look at your students as subjects, and you need to present the language as a means of any cultural vehicle, not just the cultural vehicle we associate it with being like, you know, the Anglo-Saxon world.
Okay, Professor, and finally, we have a comment from student Daniel Esteban Londoño Carvajal. He says, Professor, you are doing a great job, and he thinks it is important to acknowledge the importance of international languages like English. However, I always think about how our languages are disappearing and we are not worrying enough to preserve them. Those languages are one of the main identities of our communities. I consider there are many factors which have affected the vitality and dignity of such groups. We are prioritizing the outsiders' cultures and languages and do not know a single thing related to those minority groups. I also consider that in order to work on this, we as Colombians need to change our mindset.
Okay, yeah, Daniel, you've made some good points there, but remember that when we talk about languages, we shouldn't talk about preserving languages. We should talk about empowering them. Yeah, because if we preserve them, we keep them in like this beautiful little museum, and people can look at. No, but if we talk about empowering our native languages, the speakers are going to actively use them, and we're going to see them in education. And the way to do this is for, yes, every Colombian needs to work on this. Like, and you don't actively need your education system to do this for you. Like, for example, find a way to learn a native language. I'm a foreigner and I've studied about 4 or 5 native Colombian languages. I'm absolutely positive that most Colombians can do exactly the same. And once this kind of movement happens at the grassroots level, then the educational system will follow.
Okay, Professor, and I'm sorry, I said that was the last one, but we have a new question. I think we finish with this one. In order to the prompt about decolonization, the communicative competence development are a standardizing model to teach and learn English into the school curriculums, and going backwards to need the and going backwards the need to preserve our own languages. What do you think about this issue? It is Monica Andrea Yala Solano asking.
The question, if I believe there's a link between the communicative competence model and preserving local languages. Is this the question? Did I understand correctly?
Yes, Professor.
Okay. Oh, okay. First of all, the communicative competence model is not the only model available for linguistic ability. I'll just make that pretty clear. But having said that, it is the model in use by the Colombian educational system. It is completely possible for local languages to be empowered and preserved using that model. Yeah. Educators, linguists, and the community need to work together to build courses and to build educational units and material based on that model. It's completely possible. Yeah, it's completely possible to use, for example, the community competence model to promote the use of Colombian Islander Creole. Yeah, but it just hasn't been done. It's completely possible, but no one has gone in and done it. Unfortunately, we were always waiting for someone to do it, but these kinds of projects require us to say, well, I'm not going to wait for the government to tell me to do it. I'm going to go and do it. So it does require a bit of initiative there, but it is something that's completely possible. It is possible. It just hasn't been done. If you want to do it, that would be absolutely fantastic.
Well, Professor, thank you very much. I think those are all the questions we have for tonight. And once again, thank you very much for attending to this Congress, and have a good night.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, for our participants and attendees, remember that right now we are in the Facebook Live and the previous link in presenting an honor meeting to Maestro Gustavo Jaramillo from Unidad Central del Valle del Cauca. Thank you very much for your attendance and have a good night.
Thank you.